sometimes it's nice to see the impact, the effect very clearly of the changes Blizzard wants to bring in the game. What we are talking about the changes, is of course the balance tuning that happened a few days ago at the beginning of this reset. Now, while you look at this raid overall damage meter of this new up to today, you will see not many things are changing. Many of the effects of the balance tuning that happened this week are not really visible. The specs being buffed, especially the DPS specs, were Frost, Unholy, Feral, Survival, Red Paladin and Shadow Priest. When you go back and look at the damage, most of them are still doing terribly, most of them are still chilling at the bottom of the results when it comes to the raid. You have Red, Arms was also buffed as well, you have Survival, both of the DK specs, you have Shadow Priest and Feral. So yeah, the buff has come a few days ago and we are not yet getting to see any results in the raid. You might start seeing some initial change if we shrink the results rather than being over the past 2 weeks to only count the past week, so we get to see also more recent results after the tuning, and you see that in the case at least of Arms and Red Paladin, which were buffed, they do grow a little bit, they do gain way more of an overall result than before. The other specs that were buffed though are still at the bottom. What is interesting for today is the change, not much so in the raid, but rather what has been going on right now in Mythic Plus. Because even before we go through our weekly Mythic Plus recap of tomorrow or a couple of days from now, the results right now are interesting. Because these are the performances, so to speak, of last reset. Tyrannical, Afflicted and Bolstering. Even if we move it to the week before that, Fortified, Storming and Bursting. These are the... And we touch on how curious it was that the specs being buffed to have more damage were towards the bottom generally. You had Unholy, you had Shadow, you had Survival, you had Arms, you had Frost DK and you had Feral. The one that was the unique change was Red, because Red was already doing quite well. This was though a couple of weeks ago. At the moment, on this Saturday, basically halfway through the week, so yes, we're not fully done through this reset, but if you compare the results, some of the things are way more noticeable. Besides the fact that Red itself is now just leapfrogging all the way up to top 2, they went from being some 40k, being some 16-17% behind Havoc, as well as comfortably being some 10%-ish behind Outlaw, to just leapfrog past Outlaw comfortably and now be only 4% damage behind Havoc. That's the first change given by these buffs to Red Paladin that we talked about during the tuning, increasing their damage overall. But the interesting changes don't stop there, because as we said, Red was already doing well. Even if they weren't getting buffed, they would have gotten one of the stronger damage outputs in Mythic Plus. What changes from before these buffs to now is that now Arms is here, Unholy is here, Survival is also here. Oh shit, I broke the combo. Survival is also here and Shadow Priest is also here. Even technically speaking, while the results are not too good, even Feral and Frost DK, which still are in the bottom half compared to before the buffs, they were much lower down the bottom half than they are now. And there you go. Last week versus this week. You can see all of the buffed specs rising significantly in damage and as a result in rankings, so to speak. Pretty much every single one, without missing even the weakest ones towards the bottom, jumping still some 10 ranks above the others. Same goes for the ones that were somewhat in the middle, like Shadow Priest doing a smaller increase, Unholy as well, increasing significantly, and lastly, as we mentioned, Red, being the flashiest one, because it's now very, very close to Havoc Demon Hunter, who has been the untouched highest damage in this season in Mythic Plus. And this is to show sometimes how much of a small thing can give more relevance to a spec. For example, many players might have considered, Unholy DK to be a pretty weak, pretty middling, unexciting spec for Mythic Plus, and then they get only a 4% buff. Nothing flashy, just a 4%. Shadow Priest as well. Many considered it rather dead after the several nerfs they received for their crimes in Exodia in Season 2. This set of buffs is about a 4% damage increase, which seems rather harmless, and now currently it's almost breaking in the top 10, while Unholy is comfortably now in the top 10 of damage compared to their bottom half state before these buffs they just received. Obviously, we are still only halfway through the week, and on top of that, this seems to be a rather abandoned week in terms of play rate. You can see here the amount of runs being selected for top keys. Everyone at the end of the week, at the end of this week, totaled 4k total runs. Even if we go to the week before, we started having fewer runs as well, and now this week we have, at the moment, we are only halfway through the week, so we have much lower amount of results for these specs compared to the previous weeks. So we have yet to see the full picture by the end of this week, at the end of this reset, to see all of the changes, but for now, pretty much all of the buff specs have now made it in the top half, with the exception of Feral and Frost Decay. Everyone else, from Shadow to Survival to Unholy to Arms and then Ret, who was already here, now 5 specs, are all in the top 12, top 13, top 14 of the specs in Mythic Plus. You can find this in other examples here, even more visible for some specs, like for example Ret. Ret has gotten the biggest of the increases. Just look at the growth over time of Ret. Last week, this went all the way up to 11%. When we had our Mythic Plus recap, we were wondering if it was going to stay that way that week. It then lowered down to 8%, but this week, after the buffs, Ret is the most played DPS spec in Mythic Plus at the moment in higher level of keys. You can even see some other increases not nearly as impressive, like for example, suddenly Arms Warrior, which was previously not even visible, now you see him pop out here. Shadow Priest, which was at 2%, now it's at 5%. The very thin sliver of a line of red for DK, now it gets slightly bigger after the buffs as well. So you do see the growth of all of these buffed specs quite visibly. Even if we move over to the most used comps at the moment, you start seeing the popularity of Ret, which we started noticing ever since a couple of weeks ago when we looked at the compositions in Mythic Plus. And Ret was not really that present at that time. Then we moved to last week, and Ret was already starting to rise a lot. And we were wondering, maybe it's because of Afflicted. Maybe it's because, unlike specs like Havoc, for example, unlike specs like Demo Warlock, for example, maybe even Rogue, for example, Ret actually can deal with Afflicted. Maybe that's the reason why they are more popular. But this week, there is no excuse. Plenty of other specs can deal with Incorporeal. You don't need to bring a Ret Paladin to deal with it. And yet, they are now the most popular in the higher level keys together with Fire Mage. Now, it is still worth reminding everyone that this level of popularity only means, the keys you will be around with. You see here that the overall key level Ret is super popular now. Even if you go up to the 20 level, it keeps up with Havoc. Even in the 25 range, it stays high, but it starts losing out to the other top specs. And as you can see here, in terms of record breaking, in terms of very top level keys, Ret is nowhere to be found. When you're talking about the popularity growth of Ret at the moment, it still doesn't include the actual very high level keys. We're still not talking about the 30 range of keys. If you actually move over to 30, Ret is just in 6 times in compared to the 15 and the 53. Same goes for range DPS, where it's these specs as well. So when we talk about Ret being the popular one, we're still talking about, 99.9% of the player base, just not the very high level, just not the absolute highest level of keys. Now, we are talking about the growth of the DPS at the moment, but what about, though, the growth about the other specs that were buffed, which were in particular Holy Priest and Resto Shaman? Because at the moment, this doesn't really look much. Their damage hasn't really shown up that much higher than before after getting buffed in damage for both of them. However, you do still see the effect of the buffs at the very least, because much like we mentioned the growth, the visible growth of Ret and even Shadow Priest and a few others in the DPS category, what we also see is suddenly there is a double bar of white because one of them, Holy Priest, has suddenly spiked up in terms of popularity. What about Shaman that also spikes up massively in popularity? Now, just as a milestone, just as a prize, this has now become the best week in Mythic Plus of this expansion when it comes to healers. If you scroll down, there is no number lower than 353 in terms of variety, in terms of diversity of specs. That's still very good, right? These numbers are very spread and varied for healers, which is good, even though, as mentioned, we aren't quite yet seeing the effects of these buffs, at the very least, for example, in terms of damage, since both of these specs received damage buffs across the board, one for Resto Shaman and then the one for Holy Priest right over here. Despite that, we can still see the growth in the popularity right now for these two specs in Mythic Plus as well. So even though, as mentioned, the changes so far are not that hugely visible when it comes to the raid, even moving to the healer part of the raid, Holy Priest, which was at the bottom before, stays at the bottom at the very least for now in terms of healing. Resto Shaman was already doing fine in the raid, so not much is changing there either. It's more of a visible change when it comes to the results in the DPS category and even slightly healer category when it comes to Mythic Plus at the moment. We will, of course, keep monitoring this by the end of this reset to see how the full picture of this week is going to look like in terms of the damage of many of these specs. But for now, this is the situation in the meta of Mythic Plus as well as the raid after the balance tuning of the beginning of this reset. With this out of the way, I'm going to leave you guys, as well as many of you apparently busy trying to reroll to some of these specs or busy trying to go back to play them after they have been buffed and are now apparently doing good damage. So some of you might be busy doing that right now. And with that, I'm going to leave you to the rest of your Saturday. We are starting, as usual, the goodbyes by thanking all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and help to the growth of the channel, which can, as usual, still be given completely for free by liking and commenting down below on this video, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, it's good. Overall, good time, good weather, sun is out, even though it's cold. One of my favorite weathers.